The following review for the Stanley Parable contains spoilers for some of the game's endings. If you haven't played it, then you may want to do so before watching any further. The Stanley Parable released in 2013 on the PC. Originally released as a mod in 2011, its popularity prompted the developer to flesh it out into a standalone title. The premise is ostensibly simple. The player takes on the role of Stanley as he uncovers a dark secret about his workplace, but that's not really what it's about. In reality, the game is about the interplay between the narrator and the player, and if there's an objective at all, it's to see as many different endings as possible. Starting in a retro-style office, the player makes their way to a set of two doors. This was the concept which started the development of the entire game. The narrator says the player walks through the door on the left, but they have the option of making the opposite choice. This is the closest thing the Stanley Parable has to gameplay, walking through different doors or occasionally using a single button press to interact with an object. Anyone going into the game is probably going to be aware of this though, so it would be redundant to critique it for that. The demo of the game does a great job of giving players an idea of what the final game will entail by presenting a significant, free and totally unique chunk of the experience. This is commendable because it's the kind of game many people simply won't be interested in, and the demo gives them a chance to save their money for something more to their tastes without spoiling the game proper. The original mod version also remains free and easily accessible. The Stanley Parable wears its meta-commentary on its sleeve, and in its various routes it branches into topics relating to games, their development, their creators and their players. Most commonly, Stanley represents the player, and the narrator represents the designer, who is often bad-tempered when the player goes off track. All of this is done with a tongue-in-cheek attitude throughout. At first, I have to admit I was taken in by the charming style, and particularly by the fantastically voiced narration. On my first playthrough, I disobeyed the narrator at every turn and had a pretty amusing time. Unfortunately, that ended up being about the most fun I had with the Stanley Parable because the entire experience suffers heavily from diminishing returns. The narration is most commonly played for humour, but I found this to be very self-defeating. The best way I can put it is like this. If I randomly told you 100 knock-knock jokes over the course of a year, you might find many of them to be funny. But if I sat you down and said, I'm going to start telling you knock-knock jokes now, and then proceeded to tell you 100 knock-knock jokes in a row, the effect would be very different. At some point it becomes irrelevant how good those jokes are individually. Their effectiveness will be diminished just by their proximity to one another. The punchline is only one part of a joke. The setup and delivery are very important too. This is how the Stanley Parable felt to me, 100 knock-knock jokes placed back to back. The punchline was often different and well executed, but the setup was the same. I walk one way or another, then the narrator says something. I make a choice between two options, then the narrator responds in some humorous way. The punchlines quickly became irrelevant because they were expected every time. This is a big shame because the Stanley Parable does a better job with humour than most games ever manage. The timing on everything is very tight. You can tell a lot of work was spent tweaking the exact time that events happen and making everything line up with the narrator. The narrator is obviously voiced well and the script is even well tuned to match his sarcastic British cadence. The main reason the humour failed for me was because of the repetitive and simplistic nature of the game itself. The different scenarios also failed to strike a chord with me on any other level, largely because of their abstract nature. The non-cohesive way the game moves from one situation to another often felt cheap to me. Since it lacks a normal sense of internal logic, then it can throw anything at the player. Contrary to making the game more intriguing, I found this made it more dull. The correct story path is intentionally quite short and boring compared to the others, presumably so the player will get it out of the way quickly and see what the game really has to offer. The narrator is supposed to be the game's redeeming quality, but he feels like the icing on a cake which doesn't exist. I love when a game tries to subvert my expectations or otherwise surprise me, but if there's anything the Stanley Parable has made me realise, it's that this kind of stuff doesn't work well in a vacuum. A single, well-placed twist in a more conventional game has a lot more weight than all the ones in the Stanley Parable combined. The Stanley Parable is non-committal to any one situation, and without risk there can be no reward. One concession I will make is this. Designing a game with the exact same restraints and goals as the Stanley Parable has right now, it would be difficult to do a much better job. Within its very limited framework, it does manage to accomplish a fair bit. Exploring the different routes is certainly more intriguing than it has any right to be, given how simplistic and repetitive it all is. That said, I'd be far more interested and impressed by a regular game which is willing to delete my save file halfway through, break the fourth wall at an unexpected moment, or derail itself into another genre entirely. These are all things the Stanley Parable is incapable of thanks to its limited nature. When the entire game is built around the premise of messing with the player and lampooning various aspects of computer games, then the unexpected becomes the expected. This to me seems to completely defeat the purpose, but the Stanley Parable delights in being coy about its intentions. This is where we hit the major problem with critiquing the Stanley Parable. No matter what I say to detract from this game, the counter-argument could always be, that's the point. If I say the game was too dull, someone could say that's the point. Its drudgery mocks the absurd nature of pressing buttons on a keyboard for entertainment. If, on the other hand, I say it wasn't dull enough, then someone else could ask why I would ever want the game to be any more uninteresting. Which of these is the correct interpretation of the game's intentions? Is there an intended one? Are both of them correct? Or neither? Well, the Stanley Parable is more than happy to leave such questions up to the player, which is a very advantageous position for the game to take, but being ambiguous doesn't equate to depth. One situation highlighted this for me more than any other. Walking through a window, I ended up outside the building, and as usual the narrator chimed in. Here he talks about how this is an insightful and witty commentary on the nature of computer games. All of the narrator's monologues are presented with enough self-awareness that players will dismiss anything they don't like as sarcasm, while embracing the so-called insightful commentary whenever it happens to appeal to them. Sarcasm or not, this places a fake glitch, an Easter egg, nothing more. By itself, and even with the narrator's commentary, it says nothing about glitches in games at all. Even when presented with this opportunity to explore how glitches can break immersion, or why a player might seek them out, the game is more content just to pat itself on the back and move on. This is the entire experience in a nutshell. Much like the pretentious art and games which it mocks, the Stanley Parable is missing that extra level which makes it a worthwhile commentary on its subject matter. The self-aware way everything in the Stanley Parable is presented with an apologetic wink and a nod seems like some weak attempt to avoid criticism. For example, if I walked up to you and said, "I don't mean to offend you, but fuck you," my prefix on that sentence isn't going to make you feel much better about the exchange. The Stanley Parable equivalent of this is basically the narrator's admission that the game itself sucks, and no amount of self-awareness will change how much that's true. The self-deprecating script became one of my least favourite parts of the entire experience, because I was left with the impression that it came from a desire to construct a get-out-of-jail-free card more than anything else, as though it's okay for the game to be boring as long as it acknowledges itself as such. To be honest, I would have been far more open to the idea of playing an intentionally boring game had they not been constantly pointing it out. It's the sarcastic defense mechanism that I can't stand. The closest the game comes to saying anything of importance is with its central element of choice. This is also where, despite its simplistic gameplay, it justifies its existence as a game. If, for example, the Stanley Parable was a choose-your-own-adventure novel, then it would have to list both doors as options for the player to walk through. Since it's presented visually, the game only explicitly mentions the left door, and the player's choice to enter the right door becomes more natural. The same is true in the phone room, where only one option is seemingly presented to the player, but in fact they have two. Not to mention other areas which work in a similar fashion like the broom closet. Even so, the most the game managed to convey to me is that players are trapped within a limited possibility space when they boot up a game, which is hardly a revelation. Coming back to my issue from earlier, no matter what way you slice the Stanley Parable, someone else will always have another way of seeing it and refuting criticism of it. I like to think I have a fairly open mind about these things. My tastes are pretty broad, and I value originality quite highly. So rather than attack it in any specific way, all I can say is I tried to examine the game from as many angles as possible, and none of them result in a particularly enjoyable or interesting game for me. The humour can be pretty well done at times, but I didn't find it enough to salvage the experience. I went into it hoping to enjoy it and found a good bit of style, but very little substance. In a way, I'm glad it exists though. Its meta-narrative stylings aren't a new concept, but they are presented in such a way which may spur other developers to pay attention, and apply similar concepts in more substantial ways, something I'd be interested in seeing. There is a lot of debate and discussion about this game. It seems like the kind of thing that was built to spark such things. As for me though, I'm more than happy to move on, and probably never think of it again.